Thank you, Nori, for those opening remarks and for TD's support for this conference and the Public Policy Forum more generally. For those in attendance, my name is Sean Speer. I'm the PPF Fellow in Residence, and amongst other things, I've contributed a paper to the Brave New Work, a project that was released yesterday. My role here today is to serve as a moderator for the opening discussion kicking off this week's conference. We're fortunate to have Beata Caranci, the Chief Economist and Senior Vice President at TD Bank Group, to help contextualize what's going on in our labor markets today and what may come in the future. Beata joined TD Bank in 2003 and has made an enormous contribution both to the bank and to our public understanding of economic issues ranging from labor markets, the global economy, retirement income issues, and so on. Amongst her various affiliations, Beata is the TD chair for the Expected Credit Loss Scenario Governance Committee. She sits on TD's Retirement Investment Committee. She's a member of the C.D. Howe Institute's Monetary Policy Council, and she's also a member of the Economic Council of the American Bankers Association. Amongst her accolades, Beata has been recognized by WXN as one of Canada's most powerful women. She holds a master's degree in business economics, and prior to joining TD, she worked nearly 4 years on a trading floor providing economic analysis to foreign exchange, money markets, and bond desks. And we're fortunate to have her today to share her expertise, her research and analysis to set the stage for the conference over the coming days. Beata, thank you so much for joining us today. I have some questions, but we have a large audience, so why don't we get started, and then we'll soon turn to audience questions, which I know will be no doubt illuminating. For those of you watching, please submit your questions through the question function in Zoom. Now, Beata, the conference, of course, is initially conceived as future-oriented, Brave New Work, and as part of this project, the Public Policy Forum is tackling issues around automation, the changing nature of work, and so on. But before we get to those future-oriented issues, we'd be remiss if we didn't address the elephant in the room, which, of course, is the extraordinary labor market challenges that we're facing as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Can you start by providing us by placing the current labor market challenges in some historical context? What are we dealing with here when you place it in a broader framework?
Yeah, it's unprecedented. So most of our statistics, they go back to the 60s, 50s. There's not a legacy almost beyond that, or you get into different methodologies and harder access to the data. So as far as we can see in the history of the data, we do not have a comparable moment to what we're seeing today. So this is why you're getting people who cite that this is feeling like a post-war, or in terms of a labor market, complete dislocation, ground to a halt. Typically, when you enter a recession, you see this gradual deterioration, and we didn't get that. So the speed at which we saw the deterioration in the job and economic environment is off the charts. I'll give you an idea of what that would be from an economic perspective. GDP contracted in the first quarter for Canada 8%. And remember, we only really had the social distancing policies kick in the second half of March. So the whole quarter contracted 8%. For what was effectively a 2 to 3 week impact within that entire quarter. That 8% contraction was the worst quarter seen in the global financial crisis. And that in this recession will be the best quarter that we're gonna see. So the second quarter is likely gonna have, a 30, 35% contraction, which by the way is an upgrade in the forecast. Before recent data, most forecasters were sitting, around 40% contractions. So with that, naturally comes the job market in parallel. And so, the job market, we have this unemployment rate, about 16%. That actually is not dissimilar to what you would have seen for Canada. The worst recession was actually in the 80s. It wasn't in the global financial crisis. Again, the difference is the speed. So that jump up on that unemployment rate was effectively occurring mostly over 2 months, whereas in the 80s, it took 14 months to get there. So, when you were your opening remarks about, where are we going, the fact that we don't have a precedence for where we've been right now makes it that much harder to make that call on where we're going to be 12 months from now.
Thank you for that. You talked a bit about the unemployment rate and the dislocation that we're experiencing as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, those effects are not spread evenly across the labor market and across Canadian society.
Mm-hmm.
I want to just unpack a bit some of the different experiences people are facing, say, according to income or according to region or other ways in which the labor market effects of the current crisis are being felt differently by different Canadians?
Yeah, so in terms of the income in the regions, we're definitely seeing a greater impact in terms of the percent drop happening in part-time roles, although full-time is quite large. It's still about a 10% drop. That makes up about 80% of the job market. But we're seeing more than 2 times the impact filter through into the part-time, which tells you that there is already an imparted weakness to people on the lower income spectrum who are going to be clustered into those types of jobs. And then by industry, you obviously have these big impacts coming through within accommodation, restaurants, and retail. So exactly where you've had to have the most harsh measures in terms of social distancing, just complete shutdowns. And so this is that duality. Nori mentioned off the top that you have that 15 to 24-year-old group that's really feeling the pain. Well, this all makes sense when you look at the industries, you look at the type of jobs that are getting impacted, and then those naturally map into that demographic group as well. So there's certainly those types of elements. And then when you look at the regions, there hasn't been a province spared. Nobody's been spared in this, but there's certainly laggards and leaders. And this is directly related to the degree of social distancing they did. So were they doing curbside pickup from the get-go? Were they allowing restaurants to have takeout from the get-go? All of these factors play in. So when we saw the depth of the recession in terms of the job numbers in March and April, Quebec was bearing the brunt of that. And that's because they took most stringent measures, including reducing activity in the construction sector and the manufacturing sector, which Ontario did not do to that degree. So what we saw are these 2 big heavyweights. If you think of Ontario and Quebec, they make up about 60% of the economy and the labor market. Quebec had a harder path down than Ontario, although both of them were hard paths, but it's just on a relative performance. In May, we had a rebound in jobs that recovered about 10% of what's been lost, but it's been Quebec that's been leading the recovery on the back upside. And that's because they resumed activity in construction and manufacturing, whereas Ontario maintained their social distancing policies pretty static. And as a result, Ontario is now the laggard of the country in terms of, in fact, Ontario was the only province that continued to lose jobs in May, when every other province in the country was already starting to make some gains forward. That'll change going forward because we've seen some changes in policies in Ontario, but there's definitely a regional element that Ontario has flipped now to being the worst performing job market of the country.
Thanks for that. One more question, Beata, before we turn our minds to some of the future-oriented questions we're aiming to tackle as part of this conference. The current labor market dislocation has been described at different times as a she-cession. That is, the labor market impacts, especially early on, seem to disproportionately affect female workers. I think that that's balanced a bit in April and May. But do you want to just talk a bit about the extent to which there's been uneven gender impacts of the COVID-19 crisis and what that may mean for policymakers as they turn their minds to reopening the economy?
Yeah, so I think, again, the gender impacts are directly related to the segments that have lost those jobs. So in terms of accommodation, for example, retail, there is a gender split that's happening, and that's where it's coming down. Also, social services were impacted as services were peeled back, and some health services as well, and that tends to also have large female representation, and then education services as well. So where we saw those shutdowns occur, they're just mapping into where you have disproportionate labor. If you look at manufacturing and construction, that has fared better than the services side. Those generally are male-dominated fields. The financial services has done extremely well. Dory mentioned the commitment to maintain labor. And so that too has a little bit of a gender split representation as well. So this is really what it is. It's how the impacts are across the industry and where those gender representations are. So I wouldn't say it was necessarily as if employers were showing any kind of discriminant behavior of who they were letting go. It's really just mapping into the shares in those industries.
Well, thank you for those insights. I think they'll serve as a useful foundation for the conference over the coming days, and will be helpful for those participating. We're just trying to make sense of what's going on. Mm-hmm. With the time we have, I'd like to turn the discussion a bit towards some of the bigger themes that the Brave New Work Project is aiming to tackle around the future of work as it's come to be broadly described. In anticipation of today's discussion, we exchanged a bit. And one of the insights that you had that I just thought was fascinating, and I think the audience would find fascinating, is thinking about automation itself, what it means, and how it differs from digitization, and what these different trends are and what they may mean for our labor market. So again, given that today's discussion is in part foundational for the rest of the conference, I'm just grateful if you could shed some light on automation, digitization, and what these different trends may mean for our labor market, broadly speaking.
Yeah, there's a connection between automation and digitization, but I like to actually compartmentalize them a bit more, in terms of how I would look at it in labor market impacts and dislocation. Because automation, we're all familiar with it. If we think of the manufacturing sector as that, the poster child of having borne the brunt of automation and the shifting out of workers from that segment. And that's been around for decades. Right? Automation was 60-story, 70-story, 80-story into the 90s. And that ultimately led to smaller worker shares within those sectors. In fact, when you look at some of the criticism of globalization and saying, like we know our US counterparts put a lot of blame on China and Mexico for loss of workers, and saying, well, that's related to trade deals. In fact, most of the research that has quantified the impacts on labor show that automation is the primary source of the dislocation of those middle income jobs, and rather than just the globalization and the trade deals that came out of it. So that's when I think of automation. I'm thinking of more, it's a middle to lower income group of workers who were impacted, and it's been going on for decades and decades. The digitization is a slight shift in how you start to think about who is being affected in these jobs. Well, now you're moving up the income chain and the skills level chain to middle and upper skilled workers. And this is the replacement of accountants, economists can be replaced, AI in its predictive and forecasting ability. I hope to weather that one out long enough. So that's where you're starting to impact, to a greater degree, university, college graduates. And that had a bit more of scarier feel to it in terms of the media and the dialogue around it, because we've always had this, effectively, the social contract that, if you go to post-secondary, get your post-secondary degree, you're going to be insulated from some of the labor impacts that occur because you're going to be more highly educated, your skills are going to be in more demand. All of a sudden, the notion of digitization comes along with these predictive capacities, AI, and now people have a job insecurity even with higher levels of education. And then it's like, well, what is a social contract when that starts to happen? So I wrote a paper I think it was 2 years ago, on the notion of STEM and the impact that the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics has on the economy. And then when I went out to talk with people, the biggest feedback I got back was actually from parents really concerned about their children and what kind of future they would have in this digitized world, because they were coaching them to go to university, but they didn't even know at the end of it if they would have a job.
Let me just ask a couple more questions, Beata, and then we'll turn to the audience questions. You mentioned earlier that that recent experiences with automation have disproportionately affected what may be described as mid-skilled occupations. TD Economics has written about job polarization, what some economists describe as the hourglass economy. That is, that low-skilled jobs and high-skilled jobs seem to have been resilient to the forces of trade and technology, but that the disruption has really been concentrated with those in mid-skilled occupations. Do you mind just elaborating on those findings a bit? And then maybe drawing on your last answer, can we anticipate that that trend towards job polarization will continue? Or do you think that the new forces of digitization may actually start to displace workers on the extremes of our labor market?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, Sean, because if you look at who's been cited as essential workers during this pandemic,
yes,
who are they? They're people who are stocking our shelves at the grocery stores. There are people who are doing sanitization. So many of these roles fall into that lower income or part-time spectrum, which goes to your point about, we call it the polarization, where it gets pushed to the outer ends. Mm-hmm. That these are jobs that not only remain in demand because they're very difficult to automate in terms of just stocking things and shelves, and there's always a degree of automation that can occur. For example, cashiers would be an example of that. But to completely replace these roles is very difficult. Everybody wants to get a haircut these days, as you know. So this is why they're so difficult to get replaced. If we could all have a machine do it, we would have had it done by now. So those jobs are likely, stay intact. They're not ones that can be easily, where you could flip a dial and have an automated procedure replace it. And then at the high end, what we're seeing is a greater drive into these STEM type roles, which are carrying higher income associated with them. They are not just polarization of the job market, but polarization of regional economies, because these jobs tend to cluster within the major cities, 5 in particular in Canada. And so it creates even an inequality, not just between high and low, but between city and city, so have and have not cities. So there's these multiple effects happening that are kind of pulling you on these outer ends. What I would say that I think maybe a gut check on the notion that this middle income continues to get stretched and pulled apart is we may actually see some opposite dynamics come through. So an example would be that we were already seeing manufacturing re-onshored. This is a dynamic that was happening in the US. It's pre-Trump, so it's not just related to some of the policies there. It was happening already because labor costs were getting more expensive if you were to produce in China these days. So you see manufacturers moving to Vietnam and other places for low-cost product. But where you have high value add and intellectual property in manufacturing, many of those jobs are starting to find their ways back onto American shores. And what this pandemic has taught us, especially I think for Canadian policymakers to think about, is we have had such an erosion in our manufacturing base that there has been some serious questions raised about what is our preparedness to manufacture and become self-sufficient in this environment. And it's been a question that I think Canadians are going to have to ask themselves, that while we have we benefit tremendously from trade, but you have to absorb everything that comes with it. So you impart some of your capital elsewhere. And now what's our ability to become self-sufficient? So can we make a vaccine in speed, whether, versus the US and others? Can we produce our own PPE supplies and other factors? So this might lead to some re-onshoring, even in Canada, the trends that you're seeing in the US in terms of high value add manufacturing. It might, on the margin, you might see some influx or some motivation on that front. It's never usually just a one-way direction.
Yeah, those are really excellent insights. Thank you so much, Beata. Now, similarly, we have a number of excellent questions coming in from the audience. And before I go to those, I just want to recognize the Canadian Bankers Association, which, as Ed and Andre mentioned earlier, is supporting this particular conference and has been a longstanding member of the Public Policy Forum and supporting the work that the PPF does. So I'm going to turn to the Matthew from the Canadian Bankers Association with a question, and then we'll get to the excellent ones coming from the rest of the audience, time permitting.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Beata. As you mentioned, my name is Mathieu Labrèche, Director of Media Strategy at the Canadian Bankers Association. We're a proud sponsor, supporting sponsor of the multi-year project for Brave New Work, and we're delighted to attend today's virtual conference. My question is, in fact, for both panelists, both of you. Looking ahead to what jobs might exist on the other side of this coronavirus pandemic, how might skill demand shift, and how can workers better prepare for future employment? And tied to that, what are the foundational skills, either social or cognitive, that will increase resilience across Canada's workforce?
You want me to take that? Okay, so.
Yes, please.
Okay, so that's a complex question, Matthew. Thanks for the hard one. So I would say there's multifacets to what you're asking, because, you know, I did a paper a little while back where I said, like, let's break down the technical skills versus the cognitive skills. And these are the ones that tend to be in most demand when you look at employer demand, LinkedIn, and other factors. And I put this question, I was doing a presentation to a group of executives, and I had put up this slide that said, here's all the cognitive skills in high demand, and here's all the technical skills in high demand. You tell me what you think your teams need and what you need to prioritize going forward. Well, many of them had picked the technical skills, probably because as a manager, you're going to be older and you're going to lack these skills yourself. So you're going to build out teams with more technical skills. So these would be, you know, coding, cloud computing, data analytics, that type of thing. Very few had, you know, prioritized some of the cognitive skills. So an example would be, you know, you have data analytics as a technical, but you still need the ability to do computational thinking, meaning how do I take large amounts of data and not get confused by it and pull out the most relevant pieces of information for strategy for an organization. So that's a cognitive skill. So what it was clear is that people were focused on the technical side, maybe because they were gap identifying within their own teams. What got one of the lowest rated skills was the ability to teach. And I thought that was fascinating when I looked at that list, because I would have rated it very high. And in fact, a lot of literature does as well, because when you're an employer, it's very hard to keep up with all the digital technology. And so unless you're prepared to continually rehire, train up, and then hope people will stay or find a way to retain, you're better off to just keep reskilling and re-educating your existing workforce, which means the best way to do that is to have staffs who can teach and share their knowledge. So when I think of what that future workforce might be, it's that adaptability, people who can teach and learn. And we often talk about, at least at TD, the lattice career versus always thinking of it in a ladder. And so the lattice is the notion of learning and teaching and going across segments. And so I think when we look to, like, what does that future worker, you know, success look like? It's more on that skills as opposed to a job. I know a lot of parents want to focus on jobs. What's the job? What's the education my child needs to get? What's that degree? And to me, that carries maybe part importance, but not the sole importance, because it's more the applied across time. Because the one thing we do know about the future of work is that we don't know what it will purely look like, right? Like we are constantly adapting as we go forward. And the other thing we do know is we generally underestimate humans. We assume that the robots and everything can replace us. We see that technology adoption is actually much slower than it is in terms of creation. And that humans are pretty good at adapting. It's this learning and reskilling piece.
That's a great answer. I think I'll resist trying to answer it, given we have so many great questions, and I know people are here to hear you, not me. But thank you, Matthew, for the question, and to the CBA for their support for the conference. Incidentally, Matthew's question has come up a couple of times from other members of the audience, looking for some insight on the future labor market trends and what training and skills are going to be especially valued. So that's great. One of the questions that came up early on that I think would be useful to address is the role of immigration. Canada has achieved something few other jurisdictions have, which is to have relatively high levels of public support for relatively high levels of immigration. Can you talk a bit about the role of immigration in the labor market now and in the future as we deal with a growing demand in a world of aging demographics?
Yeah, and if you want to talk about how Canada has adapted, this has been our biggest and most effective policy tool that we've put to use. And it's really crucial. If you look at where our labor force growth or population growth has come from, only about 18% is from natural births, right? It's from just the natural Canadians who are already existing and then having families. Which tells you over 80% is coming of that growth is coming externally. And because Canada has been quite effective in skills identification to fill in labor market gaps, it's been basically our economic growth has been driven by this population growth push, opposite of what you see in the US. In the US, you see extremely low population growth. It's because they're not backfilling the aging demographics with immigration. In fact, their immigration levels continue to fall. And as a result of that, all of it has to come off of the productivity side. So this disproportionate push that's coming off of that side, whereas Canada has been able to do it off the population side. So the greatest concern is with the pandemic that our immigration inflows taper off. And that would make sense in the sense that if you have high unemployment, you have excess labor. And so the call for external workers is going to be less for firms and related skills, as well as literally the borders are blocked and there may be some resistance to flowing in as well. So there's, like a practicality to it. And so if that happens, that is quite an impediment for Canadian growth because, like I said, we have a much more eroded capital base in Canada, investment base, than what you see in the US. And so we're much more relying on the population to create the demand, to create the future employment as we go forward. So to me, it's a very critical piece. We've also, because of our policy, have brought in very high-skilled labor, well-educated labor, good integration. We do a fantastic job of encouraging foreign students receiving education in Canada, creating a pathway to immigration, having them being able to spend years developing labor market experience. So we have all the right tools. It's a matter of whether that gets disrupted and how long it gets disrupted. We know it's disrupted right now, but does it continue to be a 2021, 22? So to me, immigration is vital to the growth of Canada.
That's great. We have about 5 minutes left, I'm afraid, and a number of really great questions to get to. So if you don't mind, perhaps I'll just pose a couple to you, a few to you, and then you can decide how best to answer them. Is that okay?
Yeah, I'll write them down.
In no particular order, there's a lot of interest, Beata, on the working from home and the extent to which that may become a permanent feature of the Canadian labor market. So maybe just your thoughts on whether you think this is a durable trend and what, if anything, policymakers can do to support working from home. And then another question we have is around support for those who are dislocated by a combination of technology and trade. Your views on any views you may have on our current income support and skills training models, and if there's anything to be done to better support those who are suffer the effects of the destructive part of creative destruction. And then maybe just finally and related, last year, PPF published a fantastic paper by Daniel Monroe about skills training in Canada, in which he observes that Canadian employers seem to spend less on skills training than in comparable jurisdictions. Any thoughts on the role of public policy to encourage or support Canadian employers to to invest in skills training within their organizations? You don't have a lot of time, so maybe I'll stop there. But any insights you can share on those questions, I know the audience would be grateful.
Yeah, I'll start with your first one, which was the work from home as a permanent feature, durability. I think there will be certainly durability to the notion that we've just done the proof case to our employers that it's feasible and possible, and that I would say my team's, just personal experience is shockingly productive working from home. Shockingly, because they're also managing family life at the same time with a child. It's just been shocking. So maybe that speaks to their brilliance, but I think this has been an encouraging feature where there was some resistance, hesitation. How do you manage teams working from home? That's a very difficult thing for managers, especially if you're a micromanager and you like to see people, and now you have to rely just literally on the feedback that you're getting in terms of the workflow. So I do think there's a durability to some aspect of work from home. What I don't think there's durability to is to the 24/7 work from home, which is the model we're in now. So what we do know is that behaviors generally tend to be mean reverting. And when you have a forced policy outcome, meaning people are not choosing this, but they're forced into it because of situations, you will see some gravitation back to what was pre-existing. And then you'll have some who will opt in because they actually enjoy this better, and they find they're more productive. So we're going to likely be more in a hybrid situation when we get past the pandemic, that we'll have a greater share of people working from home, but I don't think we're going to be in this state that you're seeing. And there are some companies that talk about, maybe we can move our entire workforce of 30% permanently work from home. Having said that, there is good research that shows that you lose something in doing that. You lose a lot of informal connections, very difficult or more difficult for new hires because they have a harder time forging connections. It negatively impacts or could innovation and research, knowledge sharing. So just to go to 100% work from home, you're giving up something. So that's why I don't feel like we'll be there in a permanent perspective. In terms of skills training, it's absolutely correct, the observation that, when you look at the dollars spent per firm, you are actually on a downward trend. And here's the concern. When you hit a recession, it's extremely sensitive because companies have to conserve cash and dollars. And so one of the easiest ways that you may see that peeled back is on training. I know within TD, I can speak to our own experience, we've spent more money on it in recent years, especially in the last few years, by developing training models and supporting our staff to go and learn R and other technical skills, as well as your cognitive skills. So we are actually putting more money into the system. But I feel that there is a difference when you work at a large company than when you work at a smaller medium, because the feasibility is going to be less for small and medium companies. And so from that perspective, I think you could have more in terms of government support and incentives, tax credits, either going to the firm or directly to the individuals. We do have these programs already in Canada, but they need to maybe be beefed up over time and encourage take up. And then the last question, which was it, Sean? Was it support for tech?
Well,
technology?
I'm sensitive to the time, but it was more about any insights you have just about what can be done to better support those who are dislocated by technology adoption or digitization.
Yeah, and this gets back to that same question of needing to reskill and retrain. Like, there's not an easy way out. I think when we look at the manufacturing sector and the dislocation that occurred in those groups, where did those workers have to go to? If you were someone who worked with your hands on the line, how much time and money was given to you to go to college or university and reskill? And I think we have to give these workers not just the money, but the time. So to expect people to reskill in 3 months, is that a realistic expectation when you have a household to support?
Mm-hmm.
So from that perspective, I think that income transfers directly into displaced workers at higher levels than what we're doing for longer periods so that they can get a proper education and pivot would be ideal. Of course, you got to pay for that. So that's a more social discussion in terms of how we're going to pay for that. But I think it can pay for itself because that means you take people off of income supports related to joblessness.
Mm-hmm. For audience members interested in that question, which is in many ways the $64 million question, I'd encourage you to check out Dr. Arvind Gupta and AJ Thibodeau's paper that was released yesterday, which describes both a promising model for reskilling and training, and at the same time addressing labor demands in high growth parts of the economy. You know, and a concept of to kind of kill two birds with one stone, so to speak, and you know, that may offer some insights into that all important question. Beata, thank you so much for joining us today. Just fascinating insights that will help audience members, no doubt, think about the immediacy of our current labor market challenges, but also how we navigate the brave new world, as we've come to call it. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for all of those who had such great questions. I'm sorry that we weren't able to get to more of them.